Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guests for this series are Mary Cohen, Stuart Duncan, and Lee Willingham. Mary is an associate professor of music education at the University of Iowa. Stuart is director of programming and diversity recruitment at the Graduate School at the University of Connecticut. Lee is a professor of music education at Wilfrid Laurier University. In addition to their faculty positions, Lee is the editor of Community Music at the Boundaries, published in 2021 by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and Mary and Stuart are co-authors of the forthcoming Music Making in U.S. Prisons, Listening to Incarcerated Voices, also published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. We'll get to hear about our guests' books, but we'll also be having a discussion about community music, its anti-institutional roots, its inherent activist and inclusive characteristics, and how this relatively new area of scholarship has flipped the instructional model to make the musician privileged over the music. Even further, we'll speak with Mary and Stuart about how music can transform a broken system. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this final episode of our series, we discuss intersectionality in community music as well as its development into the future. Lee, in the foreword of your book, and this is going to be a long question, so I apologize, Roger Manty states, quote, having established a solid academic disciplinary base and ensconced itself in higher education, having gone from the margins to the mainstream, as it were, community music may have to reckon with no longer being the outsider looking in, but instead being something of the mestiza, not quite insider, not quite outsider. In short, a boundary walker. Could you talk about the complications of approaching a subject built on grassroots activism and community building, which also seeks to tear down long-standing powerful institutions, through the institution of higher education? Can entering the space of higher ed limit a project's radical intentions, especially with higher education's legacy of Eurocentric instruction?
Yeah, I think that the key here is building relationships within the institution so that you can push boundaries and open up spaces where prior to that there would have been resistance, or there could still be resistance. So my university, like many others, has privileged the very high level of training young performers in the classical music genre. So the people that are tenured or full-time historically are studio teachers in instruments like violin, piano, voice, woodwinds, percussion, musicologists that teach the history of Western music, theorists that teach the theory of 19th and 20th century Europe, essentially, right? And then a token music educator, perhaps, and a composer, and that kind of thing. So the core of our faculty have little or no experience outside of that rarefied bubble of classical music. So when it was told we were going to have an MA program that I was fully behind, and my dean at the time was, the question came up, will we be hearing different kinds of music in our building? And we kind of said no, because our classes are in the evening, so don't worry about it. but when the undergraduate, the bachelor's program came in, and they realized that there could be a rock band beside musicologists teaching 19th century opera, which is also very loud, by the way, if you're worried about volume. Or there could be an electronic digital studio up in the corner beside the big lecture hall. There became some worries, like, I don't want to hear bass guitar and drums coming through the walls when I'm teaching Verdi and Rossini. And so there was tension. But then the very practical side of finances came down, where the dean explained that our enrollment in the traditional programs was declining. And these people come in with a revenue positive because we don't spend a lot of money on studio lessons. So pragmatically, community music has begun to kind of save our traditional program. And they realize now, that our community music students are brilliant scholars, are very fluid and versatile musicians, and can adapt to all kinds of different environments, whereas sometimes our more traditional classical music students don't have that vision or that wider frame. So the idea of community music living inside now of the conservatory setting in using the same resources and a lot of the same teachers and a lot of the same intermingling of students has become a wonderful enriched culture for us, not without its challenges, but still very much something that's worked based on the trust and building of relationships amongst the growth within the growth of the new program. I don't know if I answered your question. There was something in the question about tearing down the institutions. I think maybe it's about transforming the institutions instead of tearing them down. I don't think anyone wants to tear down anything. I think there's a great place in our educational system for classically trained performers. I think that's always going to be there. No one's canceling Beethoven here.
Right.
But rather, we are saying the lane is wide, or there's another lane even for people. And in community music, we talk about the welcome and the act of playing music together and building music together as an act of hospitality. You're welcome into my space. It's still my space. So there's still conventions that have to be followed.
Right. I think the question was kind of attempting to get at the idea of how you might reconcile the sort of inherent or natural activist tendencies or characteristics of community music that's happening with, and then bringing that into an institutional structure like higher education, and how that dynamic may or may not play out in certain
Yeah, and,
ways.
and so in practice, the key way our students become they become activists, or it's certainly they become key members of society, is through our applied placements. So our students are working all through their undergrad years in social settings like halfway houses and rescue shelters and food banks and all those kind of places. They put in hours in all of those, and they develop this network of understanding that. And I gave you a very brief description of that. It's pretty extensive.
Hmm. Stuart, anything you'd like to follow up on there?
No, I really appreciate Lee's discussion of that. There's something just came to mind. I'm sort of working this through and working out like how I want to phrase a response, and it's the sense of cancellation of Beethoven versus the sense in which no one wants to do that, but at the same point, it's the metric by which all these other, and I use that in quotes here, other musics are judged by. And I just wonder whether trying to set up two systems side by side, where here's your traditional music, I read, white dead German-centric music that's privileged, versus these other musics are being judged by the same metrics. And whether we need to, this idea of tearing down the hierarchy is not so much throwing away the traditional music, but is instead not using the same metrics to analyze, to assess, to provide value to, or assume value from non-traditional music. And so there's something that's just, I wonder if there's work to be done there for the institutions. And I think it's a slow one, because it's, there is a knee-jerk reaction to German-centric music from the 19th and 20th centuries.
That's a really great point, Stuart. And the point about metrics, another factor when we're talking about higher education institutions, is the metric of faculty members and how they are being evaluated on their tenure and promotion processes. And some organizations like Imagining America and the Carnegie Foundation that are looking at community engaged institutions and writing like memorandum of understandings between the faculty member and how they want to engage in this type of activist scholarship as part of their scholarship, so that there's a clear agreement between what the faculty member may be coming in as a new assistant professor is, how they're thinking about their scholarship, and how the faculty members and external reviewers would be assessing that. So that's another part of, as Lee said, transforming the institution. And one thing that Stuart and I have done a lot of talking about in our own writing is that people make up institutions. So in that process of thinking about what's happening in an institution. Just as Lee said, those relationships that are built within the framework of an institution, that's where change can happen.
Mm-hmm.
I think also Stuart's point around the metrics by which we judge musics, we have to, if you look at the world is a big pizza, and how big of the slice of that pizza is Eurocentric classical music? In terms of what world participation is, it's a tiny sliver. And so why is that music so privileged? And in terms of sort of the judgmental hierarchy of what's great music and what's not great music,
Mm-hmm.
We're very now much interested in removing the hierarchy and saying music is music is music. And we certainly know that there are better songs than other songs in terms of style and form. We know that there were composers that wrote really poor symphonies, and they're judged that way in history. But on the other hand, people and music and places and contexts and communities have always been there, and we're simply saying that's great. Let's not in any way try to judge another person's music for being worse or better, I guess
Mm-hmm.
is what I'm haltingly trying to say.
Beautiful, Lee. And Bill, earlier in our conversation, you had mentioned the word musicking, but nobody has mentioned the name Christopher Small, who wrote the book Musicking: The Meanings of Performing and Listening. And I think his thoughts really come into play when he asks the question, what does it mean when this performance of this work takes place at this time, in this place, with these participants? Just, what is really going on, whether it's the Beethoven experience or a different style of music making.
Excellent. Thank you all. I mean, also, I'm wondering if you could discuss the importance of intersectionality within community music. How are community music leaders currently working to make music making spaces more accessible, equitable, and supportive for all?
I bet Lee has some good examples with his students. I mean, I've had many conversations with some of his students that are doing these amazing things.
You probably know more than I do, Mary, about my students. So community music, just by its very nature, respects diversity and inclusivity. It's one of the foundational principles that we've written about. How does it look? Our classes, especially at the graduate level, are made up of people from all kinds of musical backgrounds, social and cultural backgrounds. We have always have had some international students. I have a student from Lebanon, another one from India, one from the Philippines, one from Venezuela. So they bring to us their community, and their community together creates a new community. And within that are the opinions, values, ethics, practices, experiences of all of these people. So, by the nature of its very eclectic quality, there is, I think, a general will in the zeitgeist to be open and accessible and respectful of people not like me or not like them. And so I sense that the way we built our program has created the ingredients for that kind of diversity to be central to what we do. I do have a concern, however, though, that community music, in terms of its global and international reach, is still essentially a white person's discipline. The authors, the scholars, the researchers, the instructors, the practitioners that I know, and there are quite a few exceptions I know, but I'm talking about the majority, are still people who are white.
Stuart, Mary, anything you want to add?
Perhaps, I mean, everything Lee said, I completely agree. This idea of the fluidity of communities when a community music making experience is occurring, it's growing, it's changing. We've got the people that are involved. And then I think there's just a danger. It's just part of being human, but there's a danger of closing those off and being more closed minded rather than curious. So earlier, I think one of us mentioned the concepts of the welcome and hospitality. So Lee Higgins' ideas, those we all need to be practicing those, and we need to be teaching our participants to be open and practicing those. And it's every context is going to be different, but it's a challenge that this concept of really being inclusive and equitable, what does that actually mean? And what does it mean to the people in the groups, and who's not included in any group? So these are questions I think every community musician and person interested in music making can benefit by exploring them and reflecting on them more. Stuart?
Yeah, I don't have as much experience as my illustrious colleagues here in terms of being involved with community music. I mean, I think to my experience of teaching or leading, facilitating, an educational experience within an incarcerated environment, that intersectionality is not even a word that's used at all amongst, wardens or staff. It's a prison is designed to, as I said earlier, to strip individuals of their identity in many ways. So the sense of intersectionality is almost at the other end of, if one wanted to define a spectrum, it's at the other end. It is about not being inclusive. It's about not being diverse. It's about control, and it is about oppression. So for me, what is striking is that how do we make those spaces more accessible? I mean, in many ways, it's almost impossible. So it makes me even more thinking about the need to reconsider how incarceration works, how it functions, because it is the antithesis of diversity, inclusion. It is somewhere where that work I can't even imagine what it would mean to have that work take place within what the prison industrial complex is in the United States. And so that's definitely something, without wanting to put a sort of downer on the end of our conversation, in many ways, it's a sense of just being the reality and the work ahead. There is a lot of work to be done. And it's very easy for us to get caught up in speaking to people, exchanging ideas with folks who are making this progress happen in these areas. But we need to realize that there's still, we might be in the minority in terms of those areas that are making that forward motion, and a reality check sometimes on just how much work there is to be done to start moving the needle, given the importance of this, can be a little overwhelming at times, I think.
Absolutely. And I saw a video last summer of European movement for detention homes might be the word they use. So there are models out there, and there are people. Another brilliant Black thinker that we didn't mention earlier is Mariam Kaba and her organization Project Nia. So there are people really, really doing some important work. Common Justice, Danielle Sarid, and that is a program that it offers an alternative to prison. It's in Brooklyn, New York, for people who have committed violent crimes, and it's survivor-centered, so racially equitable. So there are models that are happening right now, models that have been happening thousands of years. It's a matter of really reflecting on, hey, we have like Mariam Kaba says, we have the capacity to make the change. We just need to do the work.
Right. Excellent. Well, Mary, Stuart, and Lee, thank you. That's all the time we have for. Thanks again for joining us on the program.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you, Bill.
You just heard from Mary Cohen, Stuart Duncan, and Lee Willingham. Mary is an associate professor of music education at the University of Iowa. Stuart is Director of Programming and Diversity Recruitment, the Graduate School at the University of Connecticut, and Lee is a professor of music education at Wilfrid Laurier University. This episode is brought to you in part by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.